This week's Torah portion is Chukat. Chukat is mid-late-ish in the book of Numbers. It is a funky bouillabaisse of all sorts of interesting things that happen in the Torah story. It opens with the story of the Red Heifer, this very strange ritual where a perfect red heifer needs to be found and killed and then burned, and then the ashes mixed with water in order for a purification ritual. And then there's a bunch of stuff about the Israelite peoples battling the different kings of the land of Israel. There's some funky other stuff. One of the most commentated things, if you're going to go to synagogue in person or virtually this week, there's a good chance, there's about a 50-50 chance your rabbi is going to talk about the death of Miriam. Miriam dies in this week's Torah portion, and what immediately follows with the death of Miriam is the people can't find any water, which is a problem if you've got 600,000 people schlepping through a desert, right? And the rabbinic tradition understands these two things as related ideas, which is to say that most of you all already know this, right? Most of you have heard this before. This is just my preamble. So don't worry, this is not actually the class. This is like the let's all get on the same page moment of the class. But so when Miriam dies, they don't have water, and most of the rabbinic tradition going to the Talmud and to the medieval period draws those two ideas together and basically says Miriam had magical powers, and she brought a well with her wherever she went. If you probably Google the term Miriam's well at this point right now in the class, if you're bored, you can, or if you have ADHD like I do, you'll probably find a number of either organizations or books or things called Miriam's well, because it's this wonderful kind of mystical idea. But stay with us. We're not going to focus on that today. We're actually going to focus on two verses in the Torah. It's technically like 5 verses of the Torah, two little chunks that are super weird and have no modern purpose. Okay, so one of the things I love, and those of you who've had the class with me before will appreciate this. If it's your first time taking a class on MJL with me, you're either in for a treat or in for a ride, or neither or both. But one of the things that I really like is one of the challenges for modern rabbis is the entire Torah is supposed to be holy and sacred. And it's also supposed to be for all time's sake, right? Many of our rabbinic commentators said that like everything in the Torah has eternal purpose, even the stuff that seemingly has no relevance to modern Jews, right? And to be fair, to be honest, about half of the verses in the Chumash, in the Torah, are like totally irrelevant to the modern Jew in terms of practical ability, right? There's long sections about what the high priest wears. We don't have a high priest anymore. There's long sections about the sacrifices in the temple or in the tabernacle. We don't bring sacrifices anymore. So then what do you do with it? If you're a Hasidic dude like me, or if you're into Hasidut would be a better way to say it. You notice I'm wearing a flowery shirt and not a black hat. So what those guys do is make a verse that is esoteric and irrelevant relevant for the modern person by flipping its literal meaning into something metaphorical, figurative, and spiritual. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some of that. We're going to look at 2 different verses. I'll read all the stuff. You don't have to do any of the heavy lifting. I'm going to make it nice and easy for you. You can grab your mug of coffee and just sit back and enjoy. I'm just subtly promoting the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, a lovely place for vacations if you'd ever like to stop through during the summer. Not so nice in the winter. Okay, let's do some Torah. I click share. It is currently showing shameless self-promotion, accidentally, not intentionally. I just got notice this morning after signing a contract yesterday that my book is going to be published. So you guys can look for that coming out. It's being published by Bait. And the book is going to be called Life Lessons from Recently Dead Rabbis, Chassidut for the People. So somewhere down the line, 6 months or a year from now, if you like what I teach, you can buy a whole book of it. And I would very, very much appreciate that. But if you don't, that's okay too, because we're here to learn some Torah. So with that, we're going to switch to, hopefully you are seeing this right now. Please tell me you can see this right now. Just give me a thumbs up. It
Uh,
should say life.
no, we still see Twitter.
Womp womp. All right, we'll try again. See, even after doing this in the pandemic for like months and months and months, I still haven't gotten this down. All right, I think I got it now. How about that?
Yes.
There you go. All right, that's our source sheet. So we're going to take a look at this week's source sheet. A question to keep in mind as you go through this, because it's going to come up later because it's kind of a fun thing, is what is a discovery you made recently that brought you joy or meaning? So think about a discovery, something that was revealed to you that brought you joy. That's a thing that's going to pop up in this week's learning. So we start off in Numbers 21:10, and we have this really kind of funky, fairly irrelevant verse that appears in our Torah portion. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael v'yachanu ba'ovot, which is translated with a TH at the end of it. The Israelites marched on and encamped at Oboth. One of the things we see in this week's Torah portion and elsewhere in the books of Numbers and Exodus is a strange recounting of the various locations the people camped in, right? Anybody who's ever gone camping with their kids, you know, thrown the sleeping bags in the car and driven around to a national park, you go to Bryce, you go to Zion, you go to Yosemite, you know, and the campsites are named and whatever. And you've probably done all this, and you probably didn't write down the name of campsite. Ah, yes, I remember in 1987, my family stayed at campsite 107B in Yellowstone, right? You probably didn't write that down because it didn't seem relevant. The Torah does. So a good question one could ask is, why? Second set of verses that we're going to do, and we're going to take a look at the Hasidic commentaries on, is this one. Al ken yomer b'sefer milchamot Adonai et v'hev b'sofa v'et hanachalim arnon. Therefore, the book of the wars of the Lord speak of Waheb and Sufa, and the wadis, the Arnon with its tributary wadis, stretched along the settled country of Ar, hugging the territory of Moab. Again, we have a funky verse here. That's very strange. It's strange twofold. One, the same reason I said before. It's speaking of wadis. Wadis in Spanish would be called arroyos. In Hebrew, they're called nachal. And they're all the same thing, which is it's a riverbed or a creek bed that is dry, right? It is typically a desert creek bed that fills up when it rains. So that's what a wadi is. That's a little weird. Why name the wadis? Who cares? We're not really going to look at that question, but it's a worthwhile one to keep in mind. The other question is they cite a book, right? The Torah is one of the oldest books existent in human, civilization. It's like that and the Epic of Gilgamesh and a few other books of equal ancientness. But it cites another book, right? It cites a book. It cites the book of the wars of the Lord. Why cite the book of the wars of the Lord? We don't have the book of the wars of the Lord. What is the book of the wars of the Lord, right? What's going on here? So our Hasidic rabbis, so it's we don't have it. We don't know about it. It may have been perhaps a book that was in like the Library of Alexandria, which burned to the ground, thousands of years ago. But we don't have it, and we don't know about it. And so it's a strange citation that's kind of irrelevant. What can we do with this as moderns? Can we do anything with it? Is there anything spiritual to be taken from this? You would think both these verses are totally irrelevant. We're going to find spiritual meaning from the Hasidic tradition on both these verses. So the first is a quote by one of the greats of the Hasidic world, Rabbi Nachman of Braslov. He was a student of the Maggid of Mezrich and the Dov Ber, who were direct students and colleagues of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, the originator of Chassidut, he lived from 1698 to 1760. And all of Chassidut flows forth from his followers. Rabbi Nachman of Braslov said the following on the word, O both. It is from the word ava, desire or want. And the intention of our text is that the people Israel should find comfort in their souls in the desire to serve God. So what is he doing here? He's saying the people journeyed, the Israelites marched on and encamped at Ovot. but he doesn't mean it literally. Rabbi Nachman means they dwelled in desire and want. So Rabbi Nachman uses this as kind of a bumper sticker phrase for the Jew that wants to grow closer to God. And the question that he's asking is, how does one grow closer to God? And the answer is this verse, Numbers 21, verse 10, which says, dwell at oboth, or ava, dwell in desire. The intention of our text is the people Israel should find comfort in their souls in the desire to serve God, right? So going back one more time, it's interesting that the verse that follows this basically talks about being comforted. And this verse too, vayachanu, they find chen, they find grace, but they also camp. It's a word that can be used both ways in ovoth. How do you find comfort? You dwell with God. So this really neat little idea that he kind of like throws out there as a bumper sticker text. The path to God leads to comfort, right? The desire to cleave to and grow close to the divine one leads one to being in service. And it's this kind of nexus of Torah and God, desire to serve, and comfort. You bring them all together, and that helps us to find meaning and purpose as individual humans in the universe, right? If we are struggling as people, right, find a way to clear your mind in such a way that you ask, how am I serving God? And that in and of itself, according to Rabbi Nachman of Braslov, will find you comfort. All right, moving on to the next verse. The next verse is funky. And it's a very weird rereading of this line. So the phrase that's being used is, therefore, the book of the wars of God, right? And the original verse basically says, therefore, the book of the wars of the Lord, and then goes yada, yada, yada. Here's a bunch of names of rivers, right? And so it has no relevance. Our Hasidic commentator is going to take that line and completely unread it and unbound it from its original context and just play with, therefore, the book of the wars of the Lord, which is wild. Okay, and he says this. So our commentator's name is Rabbi Meir Shapiro of Lublin. I'll give him a short biography when I finish reading this. The nations of the world attempt to defeat one another with weapons and with elaborate varieties of sword. Quote, yet by your sword you shall live. Unquote. This is the blessing that was given to Esav. However, Israel has another weapon, the book. Quote, the book, parenthesis, is how we, end parenthesis, war, parenthesis, for, end parenthesis, God. Okay? So our verse says, therefore, the book of the wars of God. And Rabbi Meir Shapiro is going to say, the book is how we war for God. It's a slight unreading that takes the word milchama, wars, which in our original verse is a noun, and he changes it, because he can, to a verb, right? The book wars for God. It's very interesting. Let me continue. By the strength of the book, we shall contend in battle, not by might and not by power, by spirit alone shall we all live in peace. That's the Debbie Friedman song. But the literal here continues with, rather by soul force or by spirit, saith God. That's a quote from Zechariah 4:6. So, and this is a quote from Rabbi Meir Shapiro of Lublin, who died in 1933. He was kind of adjacent to the Hasidim. He wasn't exactly a Hasid, but he wasn't exactly not a Hasid. He was friendly with all streams of Judaism. Meir Shapiro is a fairly well-known rabbi for his descendants and followers spiritually, but he's most known for a thing that I think a lot of people take for granted in the Jewish community, as if it's always existed, and that is daf yomi, the practice of studying one page of Talmud every day as a mass Jewish community. We're all studying the same page of Talmud for 7.5 years straight. He invented it in the 1920s, and that was his innovation. Today, tens of thousands of Jews engage in this practice of daf yomi because Meir Shapiro created it. So going back to the verse, I want to kind of comment on what's going on here. So in the Talmudic and medieval eras, Jews lived, especially in the post-Roman era, Jews lived as stateless people under the political and military authority of another group of people, right? Jews had their own country for about 1,000 years. And then they had a revolt against the Romans who were exerting too much political and social control over them around the year 70 of the Common Era, 67 of the Common Era. And they revolted and they were crushed. And then they revolted again in something called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion in 132 to 135, and they were crushed again. And the rabbinic lesson from that experience was not by might and not by power, by spirit alone, meaning violence and war is in contrast to Clausewitz, who is a German philosopher of the 19th century. Clausewitz had a famous quote, I believe it's Clausewitz. You might want to check me. He said, war is diplomacy by other means. War is diplomacy by other means. The Jews learned this the hard way in the revolts of 70 and 135, which is they could not come to any amicable agreement with the Romans about collaborative rule, and they went to war. And the result of that was genocide against the Jewish people. The Talmud records that 4/5 of the population of Israel was murdered by the Romans in the revolt of 135. The Talmudic tradition that follows out of that is violence is not Jewish. Violence is not the way, right? Now, things have changed in the modern era, right? Post-Holocaust, establishment of State of Israel, there are clearly justifications for a state, and so forth. This is not a political lecture, don't worry. It's just a historical context lecture. But in the Hasidic era, and in the medieval period especially, for about 2,000 years, rabbinic teaching overwhelmingly said, we don't establish our way in the universe as Jews by dominating and conquering. Our way in the universe is with soul force, not physical force. That's a sub-quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And here's this quote: the nations of the world attempt to defeat one another with weapons and with elaborate varieties of sword, clay, zayin. Yet, and then he quotes, yet by your sword you shall live. He quotes this to Esav, right? Who is Esav, right? Isaac has two children, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the paradigm that our rabbis lay out for what is the Jewish way in the world, which was that Jacob was calm, he was a tender of sheep, he was a gardener, and he dwelt in tents, which our rabbis always understand as a euphemism for he studied Torah all day long. What is the Jewish path? The Jewish path is study, knowledge, understanding, and discussion. The Jewish path is not so much violence. That being said, like clearly having an army and serving the military is a great and holy act, right? My grandmother was saved from World War II by the 29th Division of the Second Army of the United States of America, right? There are reasons to have a military, but the spiritual path is not through violence and the sword. That's the thing that Isaac says about Esau, and he means it as a diss. He means it as a slam. He means it as an insult, right? Yet by your sword you shall live was the thing that Isaac says to Esau after Jacob tricks him out of his blessing and Esau is cast out, basically. This is the last speech that Isaac ever gives to Esau before he leaves. And it's another way of saying, I'm disappointed in you, right? You were tricked out of your birthright. You were tricked out of your blessing. You are violent, and I don't like that about you. That's the subtext of what is being said here. And Rabbi Meir Shapiro is quoting this, and he's quoting it in the context of this strange little verse. Therefore, the book of the wars of the Lord. He unreads it and says, the book, meaning Torah, is how we war for God, right? The spiritual path of the Jew is to fight our battles, not with our fists, but with our hearts and our minds. I'll say that again for emphasis. The spiritual path of the Jew is that we do not fight our battles with fists or by swords. We fight it with our hearts and our minds, okay? To end that idea, he wraps in one more beautiful verse. This is a really amazing text because it's like 2 sentences long, and it brings in 3 or 4 ideas. Boom, 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 boom. The rabbis were smart, okay? He brings in, not by might, not by power, by soul force, saith the Lord, which is a quote from Zechariah. Many of you may know that quote from the song by Debbie Friedman. Many of you may know that quote from the Haftorah. What is it the Haftorah for, you might ask? There's a little note there if you have this text at home. It is the Haftorah for Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah is the celebration of that the tradition originally created as the great military victory of the rebel Jewish guerrilla forces against the Seleucid Greeks. The rabbis flipped the entire story to being about some guys who ran out of oil in a temple and the soul force and the spirituality that brought them back to a miracle of God of creating enough oil for 8 days, right? They unread the military conquest story and they reread it as a moment of cleaving to the divine, of miracles and of God and of spirituality. Again, the broad message of our tradition is not by might and not by power, not by sword shall you live, but rather by soul force. All right, we're gonna keep going. I hope you liked that. This next text, which will kind of take us to the end, and I'll leave some time, I think, for questions. Julie, we have like 45 minutes, right?
Yes.
Or we have 20 minutes left, if I'm
Yes,
correct?
exactly.
Roughly. Okay, I kept a timer. I'm getting good at this. Okay, so we have a little bit further on in this week's Torah portion of Chukat, we have Numbers 21, verses 18 through 20. And it's funny. It's a funny little piece of text. And the reason it's a funny little piece of text is it's a poem, right? Julie, our Soferet extraordinaire, knows better than all of us, because she has written it over and over and over again, that there are little moments of poetry dropped into the prose of the Torah, right? The most famous, which you all know, is the Song of the Sea. Az yashir Moshe uvanei Yisrael et hashira hazot ladonai vayamru le'mor. We sing it every morning in prayer. That's why I know it so well. That's why you know it so well. It's the song of the Israelites as they cross the sea, and it is a poem. It doesn't rhyme, but it does follow a structure in which the number of syllables is equal. So it's kind of like iambic pentameter in the Shakespearean tradition, where the meter and the rhythm are the same. This is not that kind of poem. This poem neither rhymes nor has any meter, but it starts with the line that tells you, hey guys, this is a poem. And in Hebrew, the word for poem was az yashir. It was a song, right? And a poem in ancient traditional times was almost certainly put to music, right? Just as we sing Az Yashir as a musical number, this may have been put to music, or maybe not. We're not really sure. It's a little poem that's kind of random, that's dropped into this part of the Torah. And it's related to that thing I said at the outset, that that Miriam dies and they run out of water. So instead of having a magical well that comes around with them wherever they go, which they've had for the last 3 books of the Torah, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, they're now, boned. They're totally screwed here. They've got no water. So what do you do when you got no water? You dig a well, right? And we've seen this before in the book of Genesis. Abraham digs wells. The other thing that Abraham does, which you're also going to see in the commentaries here, is that Abraham has to buy land for a burial plot. So hold those 2 thoughts in mind, right? That our tradition has these 2 important things that we do that recur as a motif throughout Torah. The motifs are digging wells and digging graves, or buying plots of land for a grave. With that, I'll kind of lead into our text. Then Israel sang this song, "Spring up, O well, sing to it. Ali be'er anula." Okay? And then the next line is our really important one, although it's, again, super weird. Be'er chafuraha sarim karuha, nidivei ha'am bimchokek b'mish anotam umemidbar matana. The well which the chieftains dug, comma, which the nobles of the people started, with maces with their own staves. And then again, we get a reference to places people dug wells, which is, again, like the campsites thing of staying at campsite 127B. It don't mean nothing to me. Like, I don't know about these places, and I don't know that they matter much to me or to any of us in the modern era. We're not really going to do much with this, but I'll just, it's the end of the poem, so I might as well finish. And from Midbar to Matana, and from Matana to Nachaliel, and from Nachaliel to Bamoth, and from Bamoth to the valley that is the country of Moab, at the peak of Pisgah, overlooking the wasteland. All right, that's our poem. So what the heck is this, and what do I do with this as a modern? That's why our Hasidim come to rescue us. So our first commentator is Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. So the Volozhiner Rebbe, also not exactly a Chassid, but Hasidic adjacent. So the Volozhin yeshiva was one of the great yeshivot of Lithuania. In fact, it's really the originator of the concept of the Lithuanian yeshiva. Today, the Lithuanian yeshiva is the most prized style of yeshiva today. The Mir yeshiva and the Lakewood yeshiva here in the United States are two of the most erudite, brilliant Talmudic academies on the planet. They descend from the tradition of the Volozhin yeshiva. One of the other descendants of Rabbi Chaim Volozhin himself is Rabbi Soloveitchik. I think Chaim Soloveitchik was the elder, Joseph Soloveitchik, and there are more Soloveitchiks today. The Soloveitchiks helped establish the rabbinical school at Yeshiva University. So these are some big brains, and they dropped a lot of big Torah. But he has a beautiful little reading of this. So this is Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, who lived 1749 to 1821. And he's quoting this verse that we talked about before, Be'er charufa sarim, karuha nidivei ha'am, right? And that verse translates again as the well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started, okay? He says all the verses in the Torah which say the well, for example, the well that the chieftains dug, or the well of living waters, which is another verse that I don't remember where it's from, but it's in the Torah somewhere. The verse is Be'er Ma'im Chaim. Anytime we're talking about wells is what he means. This is speaking of the Torah, right? Why the metaphor of wells in Torah? Just as wells quench our thirst, just as one cannot live without water, so too Torah quenches your thirst. It slakes the throat of the parched human who's spiritually bereft of meaning, and it gives us life, right? That's the metaphor. Torah is like water, okay? Digging of the chieftains. The chieftains of Torah are those that learn it and are digging and deepening in its mysteries. And the Hebrew word here, I loved this, was mysteria. Mysteria. So the Hebrew is mysteria, is from the Hebrew word satar, lahastir. Something that is lahastir is hidden, right? Or hidden away. And when you kind of like nounalize that, it turns into a mystery. I was kind of stunned by this, that they used the word mysteria in Hebrew, because I was like, that sounds a lot like the English word mystery. So I went and I looked it up in Webster's dictionary, and lo and behold, the root of the word in English for mystery is from Romance languages, from Latin, and from Greek, meaning that it is clearly a cognate, that the Greeks and the Jews were both Mediterranean peoples that were coexistent at the same time in the same place, and they shared common language. So the word, this is, if you are a grammar nerd, what you learn today is the word mystery in English is from the Hebrew, mysteria, and or from the Greek, which may have been borrowed from the Hebrew, or may have borrowed the Hebrew, or the Hebrews may have borrowed it from the Greeks. We will never know. That is one of the mysteries. So anyways, The chieftains of the Torah are those that are digging and deepening in its mysteries. We have this little story in the Torah of chieftains digging wells. And the metaphor here is, what are they digging? They're digging the mysteries of Torah. They're digging in deep. They're kind of, uncovering, revealing the mysteries. And this is why I asked that question at the beginning. What are the mysteries that you are discovering in your own life right now? Like, what are the things that you explore and unearth that bring life to you? So he continues the metaphor. However, karuha is the language of acquisition, as in, be sure to bury me. So there's this other place where there's some digging going on. And it is this quote from, I think this is Joseph saying that he wants to be buried with his people back in the land of Israel. And the key idea here is acquiring land of a burial plot. And that's why the verse continues. These are nobles of the people, those that hold on to the Torah. So there's the people who are machzik b'Torah, and there are those that who hold the Torah, who hold fast to the Torah, and there are those that dig wells into the Torah, right? There are people who are kind of explorers of Torah, and there are those that are supporters of Torah. And there are different kind of pathways to the world. I think as a rabbi and as a person who explicates text, one could argue that I am one who digs into the mysteries of Torah. I am a digger. Some of you may see yourself more as upholders, as supporters, as machzikim ba, people who hold fast to Torah. And there are both spiritual paths of equal value, right? Like there's many ways to be in the world. Anyhow, both these and these have a portion in the Torah. Thus the word ba mechakek, which is the next line that comes up here, which is literally by their maces, like the military weapon where you strike people that has kind of a flange at the end. But it can figuratively mean mechakek is from the Hebrew word chok, and the verb of chok is, chok means law, and the verb of chok is mechakek, which can also mean to inscribe or to kind of adjudicate, right? It is the verb of to law, to make law, to chisel laws, right? But it can also mean, it can be a noun, which is a mace, or it can be a verb, which is to chisel, to inscribe, to enact. Interesting. So he's doing some wordplay here again. It's what the Hasidim love to do. That they enact the laws of the Torah, and these ones be mish'anotam, that's the next line, literally their spears, but can also mean, mish'an can mean as a verb to support, that they are supporters of Torah, that they are supporters of Torah. So mishan is a person who can be conceived of as a person who supports Torah. So this idea is really lovely, and it's an early idea, and our next commentator is gonna finish the idea. He's going to kind of build off of it, and then we're going to be done for the day, and I'll take questions. But this finish here is really lovely, especially for those who like to sing, right? For those who know, and especially one song in particular that we sing in synagogue very often, and that song is Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachazikim Ba. Right? I've been singing a lot in this class. I should get paid double for being a cantor and a rabbi. Right? It's the song we sing when we put the Torah away. It is a tree of life for those who hold it fast, and all of its supporters, nudge, nudge, mishanotam, are happy. Although the word that's used there is not mishanotam. V'tomheha meushar, right? All of its tomheha. To be tomche is to be a supporter, but a synonym for tomchim is mishan. Okay, so we get this other dude, the Chedushei Harim, who's the Alter Rebbe of Ger, who lived in the middle 1800s. When I was preparing this class, I didn't have time to look up his dates again, but it's in my book. So due to the characteristic that Torah inscribes itself in the heart of a person, right? That's that chiseling, that bemechakek, the inscribing. And this characteristic can support a person. It can be mishan. and protect them. This is Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba. It is a tree of life to those who hold it fast, since those that hold on to it are given life. It is likened to a rope that one throws to a person drowning in a river, and they catch it as they grasp hold of it. Thus it saves their life. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Leib, Alter of Ger, the first Gera Rebbe. And to bring it back to our text, right? The verse says, the well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started with. The Torah is, for these teachers, a wellspring of spiritual inspiration, of meaning, and of purpose. It is the thing that we grasp onto, which slakes our thirst, which gives us life, and that we trust in. There are many paths to Torah. There are those that dig deeply into the little nooks and crannies, every jot and tittle, as Julie Seltzer knows very well, that if you write the ayin in the Shema too large or too small, you're going to have to scrape it with your scraper. I don't know the name for the scraper, Julie. And you're going to have to fix it, right? It's got to be very precise and very exact. But then there's the broad strokes, man. There's also like the big picture. And the people who literally hold on to the Torah, the guy who, or the gal who carries the Torah through the main sanctuary during services, is Mish'an, right? A person who carries the Torah, the person who does Torah all throughout their life without necessarily being grammatically expert in the text, is also exceedingly valuable. There are many paths to meaning and spirituality. There are many paths through the Torah, creative ones and literal ones, figurative ones and intricate ones, detailed ones and broad ones, but they all are ways in which we can acquire Torah by acquisition, by digging and burying and getting those plots of land. But we can also get them by being more, intricate and more detail oriented and digging in deeply to discover, not just about Torah, but about the Torah of life. Like, what are the discoveries in your life that bring you joy, and how is that also Torah? That's my class. I will take any questions that are in the chat. I think I got 5-ish minutes to take questions. So let's see. Steve asks, just wondering if you can give some perspective on what you said earlier about what is no longer literally relevant, but metaphorically is. Isn't that what the Talmud is constantly studied? Also, what are the chances of things becoming relevant again, such as with the pandemic and washing and cleanliness? It's a really good question. I think that's a really valuable alternate understanding of the universal, eternal validity of Torah. Some of you probably know that there's like an institute in Israel that's like dedicated to mastering the fabrication of the implements for the third temple, right? We have these fire pans, we have these incense holders, we have an altar, we have all of these things that we're going to need for the third temple. And so there are some people who believe that the way forward in Torah is preparing for the literal rebirth of everything factually in the book. I don't know whether in my lifetime I'm ever going to be zoche, to merit bringing a calf to the temple and watching them slaughter it and then getting to enjoy the barbecue in the backyard outside of Jerusalem on the holiday, as our tradition teaches. I personally find great spiritual meaning in the Hasidic reinterpretation of these texts. I also recognize that the rabbis of the Talmud basically said, it's not time yet to rebuild the third temple, and we are not the arbiters of that decision. It's up to God. So I bristle possibly at the desire to return to the literal acts of the Torah, because Judaism is not the Judaism that we all practice with lox and bagels at Kiddush and prayer and the services and Torah study. Everything we do today is not biblical Judaism. It's rabbinic Judaism. So the desire by some people, especially certain streams of Judaism and streams of non-Judaism, to return to a fundamentalist view of the Bible is, for me, anathema to my training, right? It's not what I do. I'm a rabbi, meaning I believe in the evolution of Judaism, and I believe that as a modern rabbi in the liberal streams of Judaism, we continue to evolve. Your mileage may vary, and that's okay. Okay, any other questions? We have a comment, but you can read that if you like. You could type one into the chat, or Julie, you could share one with me. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if anyone wants to ask a question verbally, we can get you unmuted as well if you don't want to put it in the chat. Just let us know with the virtual raise hand button or in the chat.
I'll just keep moving so that everybody knows that I haven't frozen. Oh, Dawn DeRoss has a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I enjoyed this very much. What made you choose this section to give as a teaching?
Oh, I wish I had a great reason, but I don't. I've been teaching Hasidut for 10 years and mostly exclusively for 5. And so I'm constantly looking for new and different. One of the challenges of Torah study is, in my mind, I'm either I have ADHD or I'm a bit snobbish, or I'm like this guy who digs wells, which is I'm never satisfied, and I never really want to go back and do something I've already done. So like I already wrote a chapter of the book on this parsha, which is completely different than what I just taught you guys. But I did that last year and the year before, or and I've taught this. I'm always looking for new. And my methodology, Dawn, to be very honest with you, is there's a couple of guys I can rely on. If you're a baseball fan, you know that there's a certain player who you send up there to hit the ball because that guy hits the ball every single time, right? I love sports also. And I didn't have a lot of time to prepare this class the other day when I started it. And I was like, oh, let me find something real quick. So I saw 4 rabbis in a row that I really liked. These 4 rabbis, right? Rabbi Nachman of Braslov is reliable. From this compendium of texts that I typically use, I have a bunch of different tools that in my arsenal. I'll finish in a second, don't worry. And then you saw the other guys, Chaim of Volozhin, Meir Shapiro, and finally the Chidushei Harim. Trustworthy individuals, right? Like the murderer's row of the 1927 Yankees. You got Gehrig, you got Ruth, you got, all these guys. I had a straight lineup of 4 guys on the same couple verses, and I was like, murderer's row is up. I'm going to hit home runs and win a world championship. It was very reliable. So that's all.
Thank you.
Any final comments before we go, or do we have to go, Julie?
We had just 2 more comments in the chat. One was if you could speak to the connection, if there is any, between the 2 roots, Ayin Lamed Mem Samech Tav Reish, Elem and Seter, and also if you could repeat what you said about the spiritual path of the Jews.
Yeah, someone wants to write that down and then quote it themselves and sell it on a t-shirt, which is fine by me, whatever. It's all Torah, baby. I don't have a great answer for you. The funny thing is my expertise in Hasidut means that there's a whole bunch of areas of Torah that I fully recognize I'm not the smartest dude in the room about, and that's fine, right? Like, I'm not going to say I don't know, so I'll answer it simply, Mr. John Nyman. My understanding is alam is generally translated as kind of to disappear. And seter is almost always translated like the book of Esther, or in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a verse that talks about God will hide, hester panecha, that God will hide God's face, right? And that's hiding versus disappearing. And I think, it would take a smarter individual who is more linguistic and literary than I to parse those two ideas. But I think it's worth just holding right there to think about, maybe at the end of this, for yourselves, for the end of this class, like, what are the differences between disappearance and hiddenness, right? Disappearance implies that it's gone. Hiddenness implies that it's there, but you can't see it. And both of those are lovely metaphors when we think and talk about God and spiritual cleaving. The final quote that I'll leave you guys with, since you guys heard it from me before, is the spiritual path, the path of the Jew is not in violence and not in might and not in power and not in sword. It is a spiritual path that we contend and we battle with soul force, right? We by spirit alone shall we all transcend, cleave to Torah, and know God. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Have a great week in shul, at home, in Zoom, in your backyard, in nature, and hopefully in good weather. And this was a pleasure. And, when it comes out in like 6 months to a year, buy my book.